All right, y'all. Even though I am not with you in class today, you are still getting the opportunity to hear my voice. And what am I talking about today? The Constitution. So if you think about what we've done so far in the class, we've talked a lot about the basics of government, as well as the foundations of our American democracy. So we've really thought about the influences on our democracy, thinking about what the colonists were originally trying to do. And today we're going to start looking at how they actually started setting up their government, much of which is still in function to this day, which is pretty neat. All right, so a little bit of backgrounds and structures of the Constitution. So it was written in 1787. It was ratified in 1789. If you've ever watched or listened to Hamilton, this is what Act 2 is all about. Now, why does it take so long between the writing of the Constitution and the ratification, which was the approval process? Why did that take so long? Because there was a lot of conflict. There was a lot of debates about what should be in the Constitution, what was not in the Constitution. There was a lot of back and forth before we could finally get everyone on the same page. So ultimately on September 17th, 1789 is when the Constitution is ratified. Very exciting. And to this day, it is our Constitution Day. So now you have a fun holiday that you can acknowledge a couple months from now. Constitution is known as the supreme law of the land, or the highest law in the United States. What does that mean? That means that all laws are derived from the Constitution. The Constitution is really our bellwether. This is what shows us whether or not things are allowed in our country. And as we'll see this semester, when cases are brought up to the Supreme Court, this is what they use to determine whether or not things are allowed to be legal or if they need to be removed. That the Supreme Court is always coming back to this supreme law of the land. Now, super interesting, our Constitution was purposely brief and vague, and that was super intentional from our founding fathers. Why? Because they knew that America was going to continue to grow as a country, and they wanted to make sure that the Constitution was able to grow with the country. They did not want to have it be so limiting that as we developed new technologies, had new experiences, etc., that the Constitution would not be able to be updated and follow along. So, fun fact, this is actually the shortest Constitution that is still in use, and it's also the oldest. So it actually clocks in, it's about 4,500 words. It's actually super duper short. It's only 4 pages. You can actually go look at it yourself. It is on display in the Capitol. It takes about a half hour to read through the whole thing, but you do have to be able to read cursive, so, you can go visit it and spend half an hour, and then you too will have read the entire Constitution. Very exciting. But really the big impact, the thing that we really want to take away is understanding that the constitutional founding fathers really knew that the country was going to continue to change, and they wanted the wording to be able to change with it. There are currently 7 articles and 27 amendments. An amendment is a change or an addition to the Constitution, as well as a preamble. Preamble, this is just like our intro paragraph when we write our essays. So it explains why the Constitution was written and the purpose of the government. It does start with possibly the most famous 3 words in our history, we the people. And what does that tell us? That really is telling us that our founding fathers are really centering on this idea of democracy, power of the people. So from the first words, that's really what is infiltrating through the entire document. All right, let's look at those 7 articles. And these 7 articles really tell us, they're really setting up what is in our government. So the first 3 articles deal with the 3 branches. Legislative branch, that's going to be the people that legislate, that write the laws, that are creating the laws of our government. So that's going to be our Congress, so our House of Representatives, as well as our Senate. Our second article is our second branch of the government. That's the executive branch. This is going to be the part of the government that enforces the laws. So laws are created by the legislative branch, and then the executive branch, that's our president and his cabinet. And yes, I am using that pronoun because we've never not had a male president, but perhaps in our lifetimes that could change because there are more than just men in our country, and maybe it'd be nice to see more than just men in this highest office. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk. So the executive branch, they are enforcing the laws, enacting the laws, making sure that they are being upheld, their full faith and function. And then finally, the judicial branch. These are our judges in our courts. And what are they doing? They are reviewing the laws and making sure that those laws uphold the values stated in the Constitution, stated in our government. And if there are laws, if there are actions that are found to be violating our Constitution, that the Supreme Court can rule against that, saying that this is a violation of either the Constitution in the Articles or in the amendments. So those are our three branches. It's not surprising that we see the legislative branch in Article 1, and as we look at the Constitution, which we will, don't worry, but when we look at it, you'll also notice that Article 1 is way longer than the other two articles. Why? Because the people that wrote the Constitution were the legislators, so of course they were going to center themselves in their experience. Good job, Founding Fathers. Okay, Article 4 is all about the relationships between the states, and this is really where our Founding Fathers were trying to really establish these relationships. They really wanted there to be clear-cut boundaries between what the states could and could not do. And this was once again to kind of address some of the problems they had seen crop up from the period of the Articles of Confederation and from the initial years of our government. So remember, our Founding Fathers, our country, people that rebelled, one thing they rebelled against was the fact that in the United Kingdom, in England, etc., that they had a very strong executive branch with the king. So if you remember, when they rebelled, they said, all right, we do not want to have a strong executive branch. In fact, they did not want to have any executive branch or really any federal government, and instead they just wanted to have a confederation of states. But as we saw, that quickly did not work out because there were so many conflicts that arose because one state wanted X, another state wanted Y, which led to conflicts, and without having a central government or some government that had more power to mediate these conflicts, it led to disarray, which is why those confederations, the Articles of Confederations, failed. So Article 4 is referencing that and establishing these clear-cut boundaries. Article 5 is all about the amendment procedure. Again, the Founding Fathers, they knew that the Constitution was going to have to be changed. They knew that as the country continued to grow, as the country continued to expand westward across the North American continent, as technology was changing, as society was changing, Founding Fathers, they knew that the Constitution would need to have additions added to it. So Article 5 talks about the amendment procedure, and we'll look and see what that procedure is in a little bit. Article 6 states that this is the supreme law of the land. It just makes it really blatant and clear that if there are other laws that are written by the states, by other municipalities, and it comes into conflict, the Constitution is going to be the ultimate law. The buck stops here with the Constitution. And then finally, the ratification process. This is the process for the Constitution to be ratified. Why our Founding Fathers wanted to include that? To really legitimize this document. They're creating a brand new country. There's not really a lot to build upon, so they really wanted to make sure that this document was seen as legitimate to be upheld by all, because if people didn't buy into it, then you would have continued chaos and conflict as people went back and forth trying to establish different types of governments. So instead, we have, look, it's been ratified, it's been approved, everyone agrees, there's no question about it, trying to give some stability to this new nation, which was super important because they had just come out of a Revolutionary War and then a lot of conflict in the subsequent years. And then finally, these 7 articles, oh, there goes my screen. These 7 articles are going to be approved on September 17th, 1789. All right, let's think about what ideas, what foundations we see in the Constitution, some of which we're already familiar with from our previous work, thinking about these foundations, these ideas that really influence and uphold democracy. So number 1, it is democracy, that is popular sovereignty. Remember, democracy, demos kracy, government, people government. Same thing here with popular sovereignty. The people rule supreme, sovereign. They have the ability to rule. And we see this with our concepts of natural rights. Remember John Locke saying, if government's not upholding its end of the social contract, then people have the right to rebel against that government. Same thing here. That is an idea of popular sovereignty. Now, when I say rebel, I do not mean take up arms, despite what some people have wanted to do in recent years in our country, but typically we mean rebel through the ballot box. So that means that you can vote for other electives and you can vote for people that uphold your values. If you have certain things that you're passionate about, you find representatives that share those values and you elect them and put them in office and you support them. If people are in office and they are doing things that you disagree with, you vote for other people. What is the common theme that we're seeing here? You are voting. You are not taking up arms and not rebelling against your government. That is not part of popular sovereignty, and that should not ever be part of our government. Again, thank you for coming to my TED Talk. All right, our next concept is federalism. As you read about earlier this week, federalism, this is really dividing power between national and state governments. And this really came about because our founding fathers realized that we needed to have both the autonomy of the states. They needed to be able to have their own sovereignty within their borders, but there also needed to be a government that oversaw all the states. And if there's conflict between at those two levels, the federal government is always going to overweigh the state governments. And that's just going to be very clear cut. And again, that's to prevent there from being conflicts, because again, if state wants X and the other state wants Y, they're not agreeing. Having that additional level to mediate and to organize is going to be super important. Our next two concepts really influence, again, one of the main ideas of our founding fathers, that they did not want a government that was too powerful. So number one, we're going to separate powers. There are certain things that the legislative branch is allowed to do, certain things that the executive branch, and certain things that the judicial branch. And they are not allowed to do each other's jobs. So we're never going to see Congress start to rule on laws to see if they're constitutional. The Supreme Court, et cetera, they are never going to enforce laws because that's under the jurisdiction, under the realm of the executive branch. So we're separating the powers. And that means that each level has its own power, and it also means that no power is more powerful than the other to an extent. So really trying to separate that so it's not all being held within one branch, so no one branch becomes too powerful. To reinforce that is the idea of checks and balances, and this means that each branch of government can have some control, have a check over the other branches to help balance out that power. So we see that with judicial nominees, right? We know that they rule for life. They are appointed by the president in the executive branch, but they have to be approved by the legislative branch. So this is a way that the executive branch gets to have a say in what's going on with the judges, as does the legislative branch. So this can't just be judicial branches are choosing for themselves, but we're seeing the other branches influence them, have a say, and we see that check and balance kind of play out. And this is also a way that we see our presidents extend their power beyond their administration, beyond their 4 or 8 years of their tenure, because those judges serve for life. So the recent judges that have been appointed by Donald Trump and Joe Biden, they are going to serve for many decades beyond Donald Trump and Joe Biden, probably for many years after those two men are no longer with us because they're both very old. And we'll see their legacies continue for many years beyond. So, fun aside about that. All right, speaking of the judges, their main job is this concept of judicial review. And this is really, again, kind of re-influencing, that's not a word, but re-emphasizing, connecting back to the concept that the Constitution is the supreme law of the land, and the judicial branch, they get to interpret things, to interpret laws, to see if they uphold or deny the Constitution or violate the Constitution. If they uphold the Constitution, those laws are valid and should be reinforced or enacted, etc. And if they violate the Constitution, then those laws can be removed and denied. Same thing for actions, etc. So that's a judicial review. And then finally, the last concept, and again, if I haven't hit you over the head enough with this, our founding fathers were very fearful of a strong, powerful government. They really did not want the government to have too much power. So this idea of limited government, that the Constitution is limiting what the government can and cannot do. If it is stated in the Constitution, that's great, it's allowed. If it is not stated in the Constitution, and if it's not implied with the Constitution, if you can't argue that the action could be upheld by the words stated in the Constitution, then you can't do it. And this is really to limit the government from doing too much, which makes sense, again, because when you have a king, there's no limitation on the king. Remember, the idea that they have been appointed by God themselves. So without that limit, that means they can do whatever they want. And our founding fathers were very fearful of that. So again, kind of you see how the influences of their lived experiences really influencing the creation of this document. All right. Now, as I mentioned, we're going to talk about the amendment procedure. There are currently 27 amendments that are stated in our Constitution. An amendment is a change to the Constitution. It's an addition to the Constitution. There are 27 amendments, although actually only 26 of them are influenced, and we'll talk about that in a moment. Ooh, something to look forward to. So in order for there to be an amendment, there's a two-step process. Number one, the amendment must be proposed. It must be described and written out, etc. And then it must be ratified. And there's two methods for each step. So for the proposal step, there are two methods, even though only one has ever been used, and that is that each House of Congress is going to vote. So an amendment, for example, the 26th Amendment, which lowered the voting age from 21 to 18. So this happened, I'm going to say 1972, but don't quote me on that. But Congress, both the Senate and the House of Representatives, they voted. They said, yes, we think we should lower the voting age. We think that should be an amendment. So more than 67 senators, 2/3 of 100 in the Senate, they voted. And more than, I'm going to say 318 or so, but whatever 2/3 of 435 is, they voted in the House. And they both voted on that. More of them voted than no. And it became an official proposal. Now, there is another option, and that's a national convention, and that's basically if the states say, look, we want there to be an amendment, we want Congress to host a national convention, we want to send delegates, we want them to vote on it, and we want that to happen. That can happen, but it never has. But it can. So who knows? Maybe someday it'll happen in our life. Maybe you will want it to happen and you will advocate and create this. And then when we write about it in history books, we'll say it happened this one time because of you. Look at that. You could extend your legacy. All right, so the amendment, it's been approved, 2/3 of the House, they both vote on it. But how does the amendment get ratified? How is it actually approved? So again, there's two options. Congress gets to choose which option is used. Fun fact, they've basically chosen only one option, except for once. But it does be ratified. It is ratified at the state level. So again, this is where we see federalism, that the amendment is created at the federal level in the legislative branch, but it's approved by the states. So we're seeing how our national government and our state governments are working together. Federalism is so beautiful. We're seeing popular sovereignty play out because all these people are elected by people in these states and in the nation. So we're seeing this happen in real time, these 6 principles. So there are two options, as I shared. Number one is the one that's been used 26 times. And that is 3/4 of the state legislatures approve. So there are 50 states. So if more than 38 states approve, then the amendment will be passed. Don't quote my math. There's a reason why I don't teach math. But more than 3/4 of state legislatures, if they approve, then the amendment gets approved. So that 26th Amendment, it was approved or proposed by more than 2/3 of the House and the Senate, and then more than 3/4 of the states said, yes, we want that to be an amendment, and that became the 26th Amendment. Now, there's another option in which you have state ratifying conventions, and this is basically in which representatives are elected, delegates are elected by constituents, and then they go to a state convention and they cast their vote, and if more than 3/4 of these state ratifying conventions approve, then the amendment gets passed. Why is this a thing? Because it allows more direct representation, right? Because right now we vote for our state legislatures every 4-ish years, 6 years or so. It's not as direct, so there might be people in our state legislatures who got voted into office, but maybe I didn't vote for them. And if the amendment goes to the state legislature level and I don't agree with them. Now my voice is not being heard. But if we do a convention, then I can hopefully elect, hopefully more people in my area will send a delegate that represents my voice. So it allows for more direct representation because it is on a single issue that these delegates are being sent to discuss this single issue at these conventions. Get elected. This has only happened when the 21st Amendment was ratified, which is kind of interesting because the 21st Amendment is going to be also the only amendment that repeals a previous amendment. So it's actually going to repeal prohibition, the 18th Amendment. So 21st Amendment, it's a spicy amendment. It does a lot of things. All right. That's enough about how we see things really being changed through the amendment procedure. There are lots of other ways that we see changes as well, primarily through the actions of our government, so our legislative and our executive branch. We see Congress passing laws all the time that are interpreting the Constitution and creating new laws. So obviously these laws do not get added to the Constitution. If it did, the Constitution would probably be like millions of pages. That's probably extreme, but hundreds of thousands, a lot of pages, that would be excessive. So these laws are not added to the Constitution, but they reference the Constitution. They uphold the Constitution. They can sometimes be reviewed by the judicial branch to see if they are upholding the Constitution. And if they are, they get to continue. And if not, then they get denied. So we've seen this probably most recently with the American Health Care Act that was passed under the Obama administration. We've had attempts to have the American Health Care Act be removed, and the argument is that it is violating the Constitution. Each time the Supreme Court has reviewed it and has deemed it to be upholding the Constitution. So that's a way that we see these laws happen. So lots of different laws. All of our laws are passed by Congress because that is their job. And then we also see changes through the president, through his actions. And again, I am using his intentionally because we've only had a male president, but maybe we could change that. So what do they do? Through their actions through foreign policy and executive agreements. This is because the president and the executive branch is really interacting with foreign nations. That's one of our main jobs of our government, to interact with our neighbors. So the president is expanding his role in that sense. The president is proposing legislation, so he can go to Congress and say, hey, I think we should make this a bill and we'll make this a law. And then Congress gets to debate and possibly write that law. And then what we're seeing a lot of, and especially in recent years, is through executive orders. And this is where the president can say, look, we're doing this thing, and he doesn't have to necessarily go through Congress to make it happen. We've seen this most recently, literally in just the last week or so, with Biden sending more arms and financial aid to Ukraine and Israel. He did this through executive order because there was a spending bill that went through Congress that did not get passed in Congress. And President Biden, much to the chagrin of people who are really opposed to this, as well as to the joy of people who are really in support, passed an executive order to then send this money. And that's how millions of dollars were sent to these countries that are currently in extreme conflict. So we're seeing how the government can still function, even though these things are not explicitly written in the Constitution. Now that executive order sending money to Ukraine and Israel, it could be called in violation as undermining the Constitution, violating the Constitution. And if it was, then that executive order would be repealed. But that's a pretty lengthy process, likelihood of that happening. But you can still see how the Constitution can still check these actions, even if it's not utilized too frequently. All right, and to wrap things up, look at these amendments, and don't worry, we're going to get super familiar. You're going to know all of these amendments. You're going to be amendment machines by the end of the semester, but you can see these amendments. A couple of things to note. Our first 10 amendments are actually passed with the Constitution. There are Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments, and that's super intentional. One of the main conflicts between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists was that the Constitution, as it's written in those 7 articles, really deals with the government, what the government can and cannot do, but there's very little about the people. And many of the Anti-Federalists, many of our founding fathers said, look, there has to be the people, they have to be involved as well. This is a government of the people, by the people, and if the people are not explicitly mentioned, what is the point of this document? So one of the compromises was adding these 10 amendments, and they're really about individual rights. First Amendment, freedom of religion, speech, press, assembly, and petition. That is our fundamental right. That is a fundamental right of democracy, that I can question my government and not be jailed for it. That is not a freedom that is promised around the world. It is something that we are very fortunate. It is a foundation of democracy. If you lose that, you lose democracy. So it's super important. That's number one. The rest of them are about how we can be treated, that we have the right to certain things, we have the right to not certain things, we have the right to free and fair trials, jury of our peers, so on and so forth. So really, it's talking about the rights of the peoples. The next several amendments deal with kind of reestablishing things as the government continued to change and as our country became more complex. So our 11th and 12th Amendment addressed that. And then we have our Civil Rights Amendments, Civil War Amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th that were passed following the conclusion of the Civil War. And this is really where we start to expand citizenship. Who gets to be in the government? Who gets to have a say in their government? Who are the people that are being upheld when we say we the people? So we saw that. And then our next handful of amendments, this is where we start to see our populist era, our progressive era. So again, continuing to expand those concepts of who is being involved in the government. And that's really influencing these latter amendments, going all the way up to the 26th Amendment, as we shared, giving 18-year-olds the right to vote. Our last amendment, the 27th Amendment, this is one that is dealing with Congress, saying that they cannot give themselves pay raises during their session. If they vote to give themselves a raise, and I think right now they make something like $400,000 a year, but don't quote me on that. But if they say, look, we should make more than that, it won't go into effect until this following session, and this is to limit perhaps some people taking advantage of the situation. And that last amendment was passed in 1992. So you could argue that maybe we're due for a new amendment. Maybe you have some ideas for some amendments. Maybe we might write about it in this class. Something to look forward to. But I invite you now to take a moment to reflect on this lecture. What are the summaries? What are the big takeaways? What connections are we seeing? And we'll talk about it when we're together in class next week. Hope you all enjoyed this lecture and have a good day. See you next week. Bye.